こんばんは、建築情報学会です。本日はレスポンスと題しまして、去る3月に行われました AIS ウィークでの基調講演のフォローアップのレクチャーをマイケル・ケイシー・レーム氏に行っていただきます。レーム氏はアメリカ・ロサンゼルスを拠点とするスタジオ MMR のパートナーでして、また南カリフォルニア建築大学サイアクにて教鞭をとっておられます。サイアクでは、建築テクノロジー修士課程のコーディネーターを務めておられ、また彼の作品はポンピドゥセンター、フラックセンター、銀座のポーランミュージアムアネックスと世界中様々な場所で展示されております。本日も大変興味深い話を聞かせていただけることを私も楽しみにしております。それではよろしくお願いします。
ありがとうございます、石田さん。Thank you, Yusushi, and also for Satoru for inviting me back to speak with the Architectural Informatics Society. I had a pleasure joining you in person in Tokyo last spring, and Satoru asked me to come back and kind of continue the conversation, continue like with some of our more current work since then. So let me go ahead and share a screen. So not knowing exactly where we picked up and left off last spring, just reintroduce myself. My name is Casey Rehm, as Yusushi said. I'm the principal of one of the founding partners of Michelin, Morandi, and Rehm, or Studio-MMR. And I wanted to organize this kind of follow-up lecture around three kind of general topic areas, which sort of frame the way both our studio and then in my teaching, the way that we look at the application of artificial intelligence to architecture. Kind of roughly speaking, those would be working with pipelines and models and platforms for perception, platforms for generation, automation of design, and platforms that allow us to kind of interface with these models in real time as part of our daily lives. So this is, you can edit that part out. Sorry. Just roughly, the MMR is my partners are Laura Michelin and Galileo Morandi. All of us are coming from different backgrounds in industries related to built environment, but all three of us have experience working with artificial intelligence and its application to design. And so the three of us came together 2 years ago to start to produce a studio with the idea of looking at how we could seriously begin to apply different forms of artificial intelligence to creating an architectural practice or design practice more generally. I kind of framed the lecture in the spring around this kind of general diagram, which is an appropriation from Stuart Russell and Peter Norvig's text, Artificial Intelligence, a Modern Approach, which is a kind of great, expansive introductory text to outline contemporary and modern thinking about intelligent agency and artificial intelligence. And it allows us to kind of speak more precisely about what we mean when we're talking about artificial intelligence, which is more of a kind of social and cultural word and less of a technical one. So within that context, our preoccupation has always been with designing through the use of intelligent agent-based algorithms and software and platforms. And kind of in rough kind of summary, an intelligent agent is something which can perceive its environment, has some intelligence about how to respond to those perceptions and that data coming in, and then how they to like interpret that into action and then to enact that back onto its context. So this thing that is responding to its environment and pushing back on it. So this kind of cybernetic diagram here, this feedback loop between these has been a kind of underpinning for all of our work. And I pulled it out in this way because I want to highlight the fact that when we're looking at how we as designers engage with these models, our interest is in positioning authorship at each one of these kind of categories or titles within this diagram. So, in some cases, if you're working with something like a Midjourney through text prompt, you're essentially the environment for that intelligent agent, so you're engaging that model at that level of generating percepts for the Midjourney models. And then its actuators are the kind of publishing of the images it generates back onto the Discord server. So in that case, a lot of the authorship in that pipeline, you're offloading onto the Midjourney team, which is actually a very small group of developers. So for us, we're interested in like how this underlying architecture can be exploited and how the biases that are built into these different forms of intelligence can lead to novel approaches to design of the built environment. So in the first category, talking about perception, that first part in that cybernetic diagram is that moment where the intelligence models are translating raw data from its percepts into usable information. And that act in itself, that kind of constructing a value proposition or like how you structure value from raw data is a significant point of authorship. Like there's no such thing as a kind of objective or purely defined model that is kind of universally going to translate and know like how some kind of raw signals of pixels or sound or GIS information or tax data can be interpreted into something that can be leveraged by the designer. So that very act of like filtering through that intensely dense stack of kind of raw numbers, which all kind of AI inputs eventually become float values or numerical values, for us is a really significant part of how we think about design, in the sense that the information that we provide a model in a lot of ways constrains how the model can respond. So in this video, I'm showing a kind of sequence of that we put together for an exhibition last winter. I believe I showed clips of this from in the lecture last spring, where we were combining things like height field data from the city. We had GIS data, GIS layers looking at from tax assessment. And we knew the kind of zoning and building codes of different neighborhoods within the city. So we're able to kind of combine all of these information and start to create an approximation or a prediction of which sites within Los Angeles are underdeveloped. And that's what we're seeing here in this image, is a kind of graphic representation of what is really just a massive spreadsheet. And then for the exhibition, we utilized it to start to kind of speculatively rethink how land area could be redeveloped, how Los Angeles could be densified into more kind of pedestrian subdivided blocks, and how regions within the old LA River Basin could be kind of given back to flooding and agrarian use, as just a kind of speculation on a more radical way about how to begin to leverage the data that we are getting into kind of massive autonomously generated master planning strategies. Here's some photo of the exhibition. So more recently, we've begun taking some of that data and information that we began developing back then in a collaboration with agency Artifact, kind of landscaping and master planning office here in Los Angeles, who is looking at trying to develop an artery of pedestrian-friendly urban design that would stretch from LAX up through Pasadena and then branching west into the San Fernando Valley, east into the east towards Glendora, which are kind of really disparate, far apart regions within the greater Los Angeles area in preparation for the 2028 LA Olympics. So here is a kind of rough, quick prototype video that we put together for them, highlighting some of the territories along the way. And then within the context of our role in this project, beyond just kind of the analysis portion of it, we're also developing visualizations, which would allow community stakeholders, community members to understand what the implications would be within their neighborhoods of this type of devehicularizing or decarring of this major streets that are running along this artery. So here's two examples that we did as a test case where we identified an underbuilt lot in one area which had an excess of parking surface area relative to residential. We were kind of utilizing our AI stack to automate the generation of a initial building volume based on the kind of FAR and setback laws in that neighborhood in Los Angeles. And then to begin to automate how building new housing and densifying that area might change the way that the neighborhood feels. Here is an example of an area in downtown Los Angeles, which is proposing to turn Grand Avenue into a kind of pedestrian-friendly public space, here activated with kind of public markets. So in this early phase, we're kind of building out the pipeline right now, allowing us to kind of automate the visualizations of these transformations based on specific data about how these each site is slightly different in terms of the types of transformations that would occur. But primarily, this becomes a tool then for advocacy. So this is a project that Chris Torres' agency Artifact has built a lot of support for within different levels of Los Angeles government, different private stakeholders. And now the task is kind of helping people understand the scope of what this transformation would be. So these are just 2 sites, and in 3 weeks, we'll hopefully be up to a couple hundred. And this is where things start to change between maybe traditional viz practices or data visualization and like what starts to occur as you begin to leverage that power that I'm talking about of building into your platforms this data analysis input that then gets translated into some kind of initial design. Is for us, it's kind of not really a labor issue so much as a kind of processing issue to start to visualize and understand the extents of a massive master planning project like this and its consequences for the city. So we'll be kind of working on this in the next few weeks, actually, and hopefully this is something that the city of Los Angeles will kind of put into practice here, as it not only is producing a lot of community public space along these routes, and also supporting a lot of public transportation, but it also within the context of the project, it would incentivize the construction of, I think, a 6-figure quantity of housing units, which the Los Angeles desperately needs. Oops. I think Zoom and my videos don't like each other. They're not like auto looping. But just as a kind of reference, when I'm talking about like, how artificial intelligence is like changing the way that we kind of engage with quantity as an aesthetic problem. This is a case compared to some of the other things I'll be showing you where we're pushing less about a kind of extravagance or grotesqueness towards the aesthetics that are produced by intelligence others than ours, but more about utilizing artificial intelligence to begin to wrap our heads around a vast multiplicity, right? Like spontaneously understanding how, a single FAR could be thousands of different apartment units, depending on the architecture or designer. I mean, these were all generated as kind of test cases. These are all the versions of the model that we actually discarded in the pipeline as we began to work towards something which would kind of strike that even balance of like accessibility towards the community while still representing a kind of positive future vision for that area. In Inglewood, actually, the site is located. So, these 3 territories are really muddy and gray and kind of overlapping, but I wanted to kind of set them out. Like obviously in the context of that last project, we're, in most of our projects moving from that analysis into the generative, right? So even though the video in that one is produced through generative AI, I think in the context of that Olympic Trail project, we're primarily interested in kind of analytic power, the ability to identify valuable sites within the city. And the aesthetic, the production there is more about accessibility or visualization. The kind of next few projects I'm showing are going to be looking more at how the internal biases and structurings of the kind of generative artificial intelligence models that we use for automating design start to produce kind of their own innovations on design aesthetics. I think I wrapped up the lecture in spring with this project, and I just kind of quickly said, "Oh yeah, we made some wallpaper," and Satoru cut our time because I think we were having so much fun we ran way over. But I'll just pick up here. So this is a series of 3 prints that we've been working on as part of a larger project to produce a platform for infinitely scalable AI images with the idea of using it for wallpaper for retail space. Within that context, we needed to kind of really rethink the way in which AI models operated. And also we were using it as an opportunity to play with the fact that do this kind of numerical flattening that I was mentioning about how AI models take in data or information, allow us to start to push aesthetic regimes which kind of oscillated between kind of the graphic, the orthographic, or the drafted or the drawn, the geometric, while simultaneously kind of being mutable towards those more figurative, or not figurative, maybe more figural sculpted elements. And the idea that from the perspective of artificial intelligence, these are like conditions that it could mutably swing between without creating a dialectic. So this, within the context of building these wallpaper proofs here, which we'll be exhibiting on the 7th at a gallery in downtown LA. We really looked at like taking some of the intelligence that we built into the models for like the same type of percept analysis that we use for developing things for doing kind of large scale master planning, like the projects I was just showing, as drivers for kind of large scale image production to produce these aesthetics, which kind of again like hover between the striated or the kind of graphic and the figurative. There's a couple of zoomed in photographs of those panels. There's a kind of slow fade past them. Within the context of this project, we were specifically looking at tuning the artificial intelligence models towards specific kind of color theory or color strategies around a kind of primary color base, kind of referencing things as disparate as kind of Joseph Albers' work, Johannes Itten's work, and the kind of disagreements they had between them, as well as more naturalistic effects. So we have things which are, sometimes oscillating between the aesthetic of a painting and other times kind of photoreal vegetation as you begin to zoom in. That was the blue painting. This is the kind of green one, or blue image and the green image. And this is the red one, which is kind of the most vulgar or grotesque of the three. So within the context of producing these images, there's a necessity for sampling and resampling. And as significant as the generative side of that AI stack that we built is how the AI can understand its context, which to us is a kind of fundamentally architectural problem in the sense that we never design buildings within a kind of tabula rasa environment, that there's always constraint and context. So even the production of an image like this, the most significant part of our positioning of authorship, I would say, just in terms of software development, was in the ability for the AI model to intelligently read in like other parts of the image at different resolutions, different scales, as it resampled itself continuously to produce the infinite canvas. And that precision, like how it responds to these inputs, allows us to produce these kind of seamless, infinite images. When most AI image production, you're constrained to kind of 1024 square images, maybe upscaling it by 4 times or so with some of the AI upscaling models. So in this case, the image becomes this kind of imminent thing which could endlessly expand and kind of consume an entire room, which is our long-term goal for this. So I touched a little bit, I think, in spring on our use of kind of text to 3D AI models. This is an example of a text-driven clip-guided Gaussian splat, which is a method for regressing 3D geometry in space based on kind of virtual cameras and then feeding them through the same kind of clip-based kind of image analysis that's used to drive things like the 2D stable diffusion, except here instead of like denoising an image or regressing the positions of these kind of elliptical shards called Gaussian splats. I think at the time of the lecture last spring, I also showed some examples of our older 3D GAN-based work as a kind of contrast to this, but like within this work, I'm just going to kind of show some examples of how we've been advancing this pipeline. So these 2 examples here are from some of our early experiments last last fall, both in terms of like trying to create greater coherence or density, like moving from right to left. I think there's a increased sophistication and control of the elliptical fields. But also looking at like how, you know, those elliptical fields become actuated into something which could be 3D printed or physically constructed. So also looking at not just the behavior of the Gaussian splat in a vacuum, but how it begins to meet things like tectonics or materiality. Our kind of ongoing project that we have that we've been developing continuously is looking at how to produce a line of furniture, which would be like a kind of a text to chair, kind of revisiting that kind of long held dream project of the mass customized furniture, which has always been difficult because of the realities of fabrication, construction, and production. As 3D printing improves, it's still this thing that seems to be latent in our future. And interestingly for us is we're curious about how the ease and accessibility and increased precision of creating 3D geometry from text-based prompts could start to allow for a unique relationship between user customization and production, where, you know, us as authors are developing a certain aesthetic regime that is driven by our own biases, our own interests. Like we never make claims of producing unbiased or objective AI models. I don't think that's a thing that exists. But we are looking at then like how do you begin to filter that through a user engagement to still produce something that has an aesthetic coherence that we are interested in. So these are kind of three different prompts running on our most recent version of this model. So as this video has been running, I think you can see a kind of clear progression in fidelity between like this stage from last winter to the more contemporary ones from the summer, where we're starting to get a much finer control. Like they're still fairly coarse. And this is something that we're, I think, still kind of pushing to try to get to a point where we're happy with it aesthetically, where it becomes less of something where there is an appearance of a kind of AI blotchiness maybe, and something which just feels like a kind of polished product. But at the same time, we are fascinated by the qualities of the kind of part to whole relationship between these little elliptical splats and the overall figure of the chair. And also like within these last series of chairs here, we have a kind of embedded intelligence about simulation for 3D printed plastics to ensure, you know, no overhangs or kind of structural integrity, so that no matter what you type in, it produces a chair that has a kind of viability towards function. I'm just going to show these quickly. I covered them more, I think, last spring. These are some older projects. Actually, the house on the left, it was designed using an old 3D GAN that we had trained. And it kind of set off an interest in the office, also in some of the work that I did in partnership with Yasushi on mass timber-based construction and how artificial intelligence models and different automation models and robotic fabrication could be leveraged to rethink things like CLT panels and develop kind of customized layup schedules for those panels for performance and sustainability, but also clearly in the image on the left, like allowing us to rethink what the possibility of a floor plan could be when you're liberated from the constraints of things like column grids and the types of structural systems that we typically use in residential architecture. So this is a kind of two-part plan, like a project, you know, one looking at the specific engineering requirements and production requirements of these types of panels, which could be deployed in this kind of loose, let's say more diffuse field-like distribution of material to create the implication of spaces within a larger whole. But also how a floor plan begins to change, or the spaces that we occupy begin to change through that lens of material assembly being done by an intelligence other than our own. It's still an intelligence that is developed by us and trained by us, and working towards an ambition of a certain amount of functionalism. But at the same time, you know, fundamentally, an intelligence which understands, let's say, a floor plan, you know, as a series of numbers which are outlining the probability of whether some specific space on that 2D image or in the 3D voxel space is a solid or a not. And so it allows us to kind of rethink the architecture as an accumulation of probabilities of void versus solid, as a giving that kind of prevalence or hierarchy in how we organize space rather than in kind of legibility of diagram or kind of formal party. This is a project I also showed last spring, which was a kind of, let's say, lower resolution version of that, where rather than deploying those strategies to literally lay up every single timber in a panel, is looking more at using that strategy to organize something that's more operating at the kind of 2 by 4 meter prefabricated steel grid for a solar panel array. This was a project we did for a solar panel canopy in Conakry and Guinea. And kind of showing how the implication of resolution and spatial requirement changes the quality of output of this pipeline. It's a almost identical pipeline to the one used in the last series of projects I showed, just at a significantly lower resolution. One thing that's in common with both these projects, I think I meant to put in some of the photos of the wood panels we've been developing with the robot in relationship to this, is that for a whole number of reasons, these projects were largely dominated as like single floor plan focused. In this case, RCP in the house and the other ADU prototypes we've been doing, like kind of single story plan focused architecture. We wanted to begin to explore some pipelines that would also take into account section and program. Hold on, I think I can hear my clicking sounds. Okay. So this was a quick pipeline that we built up for one of the platforms which we were using on a couple of projects here in the office now, for allowing us to simulate program distribution and massing across a constraint. And here, like rather than starting with the floor plan, we specifically wanted to start the projects with something that was dealing with section. So we were encoding adjacency behaviors, both in terms of program to program, program proportion, as well as site distribution and where on a site a specific geometry would sit, based on things like some things are really pragmatic, like the loading dock needs to be at a certain corner of the site to access the street, where on other corner of the site requires the situation of things like restaurants and shops for this particular project. So this is a kind of simulation. And one of the things that we wanted to do, or start kind of integrating into the pipelines that we're building in the office, is whereas a lot of the previous pipelines, the interface was you as the designer, besides the fact that we were designing the pipelines themselves, but in their kind of application, we would be feeding an input and then just getting a result out. It was like, this thing becomes this other thing, and we would just take us straight to the building. We built this in to kind of mix the ML-based optimization with interaction, so allowing the user to kind of click and drag on specific program elements, and then resorting or resetting the program diagram to regress the positions back towards their kind of optimized packing and adjacencies and connection. This is just an example of 6 of the kind of program volumes that we generated with that application. You know, one thing about that simulation I was just showing, like we were representing visually the program as ellipses, but they're actually these kind of Gaussian clouds, which allows us to create kind of soft boundaries between programs, which then when we feed them into our plan generating or our subdivision algorithms, like they can begin to read that probability space where something is in between 2 different states, to understand how to deal with the interfaces or thresholds between those types of programs. So like along those lines, this is just some examples of part of the pipeline that we developed, where we'd take those program volumes and then feed it through an AI model that we trained on structural spring points to look at how enclosure could be developed around those different program volumes, and simultaneously a kind of much lower resolution version of the CLT regression models that we're using for doing individual panels, looking now at the scale of a whole space. So the lines here are representing complete panels rather than like individual planks like in our other project. Here's a kind of quick screenshot of the outputs from that. And an example of the type of space that was generated there. So, for us, it was really important in this project that we begin to expand the thinking that we had largely in plan, also vertically in section. This is a kind of multi-story space. And also, as the kind of segue into the next part of the lecture, beginning to look at how surface and this accumulation of surface as a way of defining space lends itself towards thinking about how interface and media can begin to become a spatialized element within our architecture. We've been experimenting a lot with different AI video pipelines as a visualization tool. So you can see like the structure is pretty clean, but then the dude just kind of walks through the bench. So I don't know, it's baby steps, I guess. Anyway, I kind of like that. So this is actually an older project from 2016. It's an installation I did at SCI-Arc using some really old models for the physical structure, but it's just to show that this preoccupation with embedding intelligence and spatializing these intelligent agents into the built environment has been something that we've been kind of trying to push and engage with over time. I think within this project, we're limited by certainly the level of technology at the time, the kind of processing power and the sophistication of it, but we used it as a way of beginning to test case like how you could begin to individualize a space through layering perceptual devices into it. So it had 5 media surfaces. Each one was running content which was driven by user occupation of the space through web cameras, depth cameras, audio. I think the first thing we had up there we called Godzilla Cam because the idea was it would create little specific views for each user as they track through the space. So each one of those kind of moving partitions from the drone photographs were aligned specifically to an individual within the installation. So when I talk about like what I mean when I say that our technological sophistication has dramatically improved, in that case, we are looking mostly at producing kind of glitch art or data bended transformations of a user and trying to rebroadcast that as a wallpaper almost. And this is a video from the final event of the program that I teach at SCI-Arc. It's a 1-year Masters of Science program, which specifically looks at the integration of artificial intelligence to the design of the built environment. And our students produce for their final project, independent research project. A lot of them are producing fully functioning apps. A lot of them taking these out into the world into practice. The kind of agenda of the program is about radicalizing practice. But this kind of idea about spatialized AI and AI as a kind of mediating thing within our lives has really kind of come back strongly within the context of the program and in our office. And I think a lot of that has to do with the dramatic improvements of integration and engagement that some of the large language models provide. So I'm showing this because in the background here, projected above this panel discussion, which we do a kind of roundtable panel with our students and a series of kind of guest experts from all around the world, but also a lot of them in Los Angeles because it's a kind of amazing epicenter for this kind of design and technology. That back projection is a real-time, let's say like a moderator AI model that's being run on Figma. And it's actually listening to our panel. And in real time, it's It's generating questions for the panel. It's doing Google searches to identify references for what's being discussed, fact checking the panel to an extent, and also kind of generating diagrams and representational imagery of what the people are describing in the panel. So this was put together by Case Miller, who is co-teaches with me in the program, and Evangelos Kountsioupas, who is just a recent grad of the program, who's been utilizing this as a way of trying to develop transparent communication between developers and community stakeholders in Los Angeles. So for us, this has now become a thing. Like as we start to look at being able to have spaces which can actually respond to us in intelligent ways, reshape our environment, provide us information. Like essentially the wall in the background is doing work, but also changing the discussion. So the panel can all see it looking at a screen that's on the table there. And what we're interested now in the office is what does it mean to actually have just ambient artificial intelligence within our built environment? This is more just an aside. This is just a kind of photo of where it ended up at the end of the night. One of the we were using the new Flux model that just came out just to try to see, how it would work compared to some of our other image pipelines. It's probably a bad choice to test a model that we've never used before on the night of our final exhibition, but it's interesting to us to start to always like kind of throw these things at the wall and start to unpack like what are its shortcomings, what are its biases, like what are the things that it represents. We think it's interesting that the kind of formal language it's using to represent the kind of contemporary design that might be at SCI-Arc is maybe now 30 years old, right? Like it's maybe closer to the type of work that was being done at SCI-Arc when Yusushi was a student, or I was a student there back in the early 2000s, right? But it's the kind of persistent style which has started to dominate the internet, which these models have been trained on. So it has a kind of bias towards producing that sort of content. Anyway, so this is an installation that we recently did for the Getty PST, which is a kind of every 4-year exhibition series that the Getty sponsors, where it ties in together different exhibitions or different galleries and institutions throughout Los Angeles. And we were interested in this idea of just a kind of ambient artificial intelligent agent that was built into the physical space, or a kind of intelligent wall. And specifically, we wanted to look at kind of undercutting a lot of the preconceptions about what that would be. Like, let's say some of the sci-fi tropes, the kind of cliche dystopic views of these things, while simultaneously in the case of this, where it's a kind of more of an art exhibition, also not defaulting to the kind of purely pragmatic, maybe like Apple Vision Pro aesthetic for how this thing probably will actually become deployed out, and maybe the direction that we're taking some of our other work. So in this case, we produced installation which would kind of mirror the users. It was creating generative content from using surveillance that was both the people that were in this small room within the gallery, but also in the larger gallery space, and compositing that with an agent that would start to engage you based passively, just by kind of looking at you, describing you, and then kind of gently flirting with you throughout the evening. We wanted to kind of create this thing which you would just be this continuous dopamine kick as you inhabited a space with this friendly, vaguely floral, vaguely kind of Victorian, I don't know, cocktail bar vibe with an artificial intelligence which was just kind of reinforcing all of your kind of narcissistic sensibilities. This is a test of the language component on its own from an early test without the rest of the project. We had to use a kind of lighter weight model for this, which was interesting to us because it also exposed, what level of intelligence could be had at what level of, let's say, expense, both in terms of resources, but in literal cost, and in processing power. And, basically, if you were wearing glasses, it was going to flirt with you about your glasses. If you were wearing a suit, it would talk about your suit. Like, these are kind of like really unsophisticated, summarizations of the user. We've been maintaining this thing remotely, so checking in periodically to see how it's doing. So this is actually a screen capture of us checking to make sure it's still running. I think you saw someone walking across the gallery. Yeah, probably Liz, the gallery owner. To maintain it, this is kind of it in action. We started to just kind of layer a bunch of different analytic package on it, beyond just the text, the kind of flirtatious comments you can see in the lower left-hand corner. But also like looking at the kind of individual tracking. And we were curious as we were like feeding the user through this kind of mirroring effect, through this kind of AI filter, like the legibility of that object as a human. So it's also simultaneously like using an image classifier to kind of probabilistically say like how likely that thing is on the images as another human. Obviously, like the kind of wallpaper and the frame were generated with the same infinite stack that we've been using for the image series that I showed at the beginning, but kind of tuned to our more, let's say, like commercial aesthetic. Here's some small children interacting with it, which I was concerned with at first, but it was mostly okay. That's fine. That's Christy Ballier, actually the undergraduate chair at Principal Bear Ballier and her son Enzo. And my favorite kind of response that it came back with during the evening was it just kind of gave up when there was just too many people, like they were leaning in towards the camera, and it just said, I'm sorry, I can't help with that. As a kind of quick turnaround, us deploying the platform further, in the context of that exhibition, we weren't really allowed to work with sound because of it was in a gallery with several other artists' pieces. So kind of being respectful of that, we clamped the wall to only be working through text. We rolled a kind of similar version of the platform out at an exhibition recently in Bogota, which you can kind of see on the right. But in this case, we were also having the AI speak to you using a kind of text to language stack. So you can enter into a conversation. So simultaneously, it was listening to what people were talking about in the gallery and then communicating back with them, just kind of these comments or critiques of the exhibition that was going on around it. And in a funny way, this actually kind of emerged out of a kind of certain need. The types of computers we could access at that exhibition were not powerful enough to run all of the kind of image stack on this. So there's a kind of looping video from a previous project running. And instead, we just emphasized the language stuff because we were able to run that on the cloud more efficiently. So for us, we're kind of looking to how do we begin to combine and push these things together, like embedding the architecture with kind of different ways of understanding its user, like the kind of spatial machine vision method we use to drive the installation for PST, and then also the kind of audio perception that can come in through various models to begin to control that interaction engagement as well. And what we're doing right now is we're working with we're collaborating with Wei-Chun Cheng, who's teaching at Carnegie Mellon right now. He's actually an alum from our program for upcoming Taiwan Design Week exhibition, where we're producing an installation looking at interactivity and domesticity. And this is a kind of, all of this is very much work in progress. The exhibition will be opening up in December. Essentially, it's going to be kind of two projected screen surfaces, one with an interactive apartment designer, which will be using kind of voice command, this kind of language-based interaction that we've been using for the last piece. And then another thing, which is going to be a kind of more analytic, like archival project, search engine-based project and analysis-based project, which Wei-Chun has been doing, that is kind of looking at an archive of like what do domestic environments in Taipei specifically look like, and how do people think about them, and how they describe them, and how do they discuss their houses. So this is going to be a kind of two-part exhibition with a kind of generative component, which is looking to try to understand like how a space can evolve through engagement with the occupant on the right side and on the left side, trying to kind of unpack some of our biases or latent tendencies that we might not acknowledge about the way that we view our built environment. These physical models are kind of placeholders. An early version of the app that we developed was looking more at kind of external housing. We were aiming to try to combine our 3D splat-based workflows with the language-based interfaces that I've been describing. And we've moved away from that towards just looking specifically at the interior because of the nature of housing in Taipei is primarily driven by kind of apartment life, less so than like freestanding houses. But we will be producing, using this stack, a series of kind of sectional chunk models of apartment buildings. So these are some kind of AI generated orbits of some of the apartments that our text engagement AI has been designing with us, which will be kind of 3D printing. Like this is the current state of what those turn into. But those little white models will be about 30 of these apartment interiors that will be 3D printing prior to the opening of the show. We're kind of hoping to get something closer to this. This is our first swing at it. I like it. I don't know if it's ready for the building department though. I mean, these are just some of the examples as we've been pushing the real-time AI models for image generation. So the workflow or this pipeline for this interface is going to have kind of 3D geometry embedded into it with some of our AI plan generation techniques, something similar maybe to the way we did the structure for the project I showed earlier, with kind of continuous feedback about aesthetics and style. And what we're doing right now is looking at like how many times like a image can be refed through itself before it starts to degrade. So as we're moving through these different as the user is like adding detail into each one of these shots or changing certain components of it, moving benches around, moving walls around. I think in the lower right-hand corner, they asked for some Victorian wallpaper on some of it. On the left-hand one, they asked to be more of a cyberpunk aesthetic. There's like as the kind of outputs of each generation feeds back in, as you're changing to some part, there's a certain degradation that occurs that we're looking to see if we can either leverage towards some kind of aesthetic result or emerges, or we can get rid of. So you can see in the lower right-hand corner, there's quite a bit of degradation to the integrity of the image in terms of its ability to respond precisely to the underlying AI-generated 3D model, which you can see in the upper left. Or you can see in the upper left that it's the initial transformation of it has got a lot more precision in terms of its both image quality and its proportion. So within the context of this interface, this is something that Wei Chen has been developing. I'm mocking this up right now in the interface where beyond just you communicating to it verbally how you would like your apartment to be designed, it's going to be providing these like narrative descriptions of how it thinks you live as a human being or like how your apartment describes yourself. So through both like the things you're saying to the AI model and both its interpretation of the apartment designs that emerge from that, it starts to kind of profile you maybe in a potentially uncomfortable way or critical way based on what it sees here. So this is a quick narrative that it produced. I don't know why. I just noticed it's using Wei Chen's name. Spelled it wrong. I didn't. All right, I have some work to do later. It shouldn't know who he is. Anyway, it's kind of breaking down based on this apartment interior, like who it thinks he is as a person, right? And this is kind of reflecting back on this idea about kind of defining ourselves through the spaces that we create or that we inhabit and how we furnish them and aestheticize them, which is, basically the intro to Fight Club, right, back in the 90s, but kind of rethinking that now through this lens with the idea of as a kind of provocation for people to begin to kind of push their domestic aesthetics as they, get in this feedback loop with this interface towards some space that they hadn't thought they would arrive at previously, purely through being self-conscious that they are in some way being kind of cliche or banal in terms of their lifestyle. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So that was a lot. So can you remind me, like there were three parts, right? So perception, generation, and then like so the talk was sort of divided into, I think, three parts. So the first one was sort of the Inglewood neighborhood. It was about sort of accessibility, accessible aesthetic and visualization to the community. So just to kind of like engage, make people understand the impact of the proposal.
Yeah, so I mean, in that case, like the project is really about the analysis. However, you don't, you can't rock up with a spreadsheet to a meeting and expect people that aren't architects or developers to understand it. So in that case, there is a generative component, but it's actually, even though it's probably our most polished looking thing at this point, like is actually the least significant part of that project in terms of our like thinking and time consumption. Right?
Which was kind of interesting. It kind of connects back to the panel that we had with you and Jills and Leo.
Yeah,
Leo. How Jills described that it's what he was interested in was more about generating 99% of non-special architecture as opposed to creating this sort of signature Starchitect type extravagant architecture, which is really very much what this is about, right? But I think it's super powerful in the sense that it's in terms of community engagement or outreach, just making the general public understand the consequence or impact of whatever the proposal is, which is, I think, really the bulk of what architects are responsible for, I think. In terms of, if you think about the quantity of architects and quantity of projects that our architects are involved in, and like how many percentage of the projects are the ones that would be on the cover of El Croquis or A Plus U, and then there are if the countless numbers of architects who are maybe not well known, but they're engaged in these sort of public projects that we have community hearings and all these things, but it takes tremendous effort to make it accessible, I think, if I borrow your word, to non-architects to understand what it is that we're proposing or it's about to be built, so that people can understand whether they agree with it or disagree with it. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things, like obviously we are still preoccupied with aesthetics at one end, but I think there's a question about, the joke is now like my mother, who has no design education, can now generate virtuosic images and aesthetics if she's using Midjourney, right? Because it's such a constrained production pipeline that essentially anyone looks like an expert. So on the one hand, we're looking at like how to produce aesthetics that it can't make, right? I think that's driving a lot of the aesthetic work. So still looking for like what's unique or what would be the thing that is rare within the context of that kind of image production. But I think increasingly we're obsessed with what are the other roles that the architect or the designer can do within the discipline and within practice. I think the radical image might be something which is less significant moving forward, and instead looking at like what other ways that we can expand our discipline and create continued innovation and cultural relevance. So some of it, it's about the kind of thinking about spatial interface, but in other ways it's like thinking about actually using these models to be more intelligent and sophisticated about engaging with complex problems, right? Like dealing with community urban scale projects. I think you could look at things a lot of different ways, but a lot of the kind of vast master plan projects that architects do historically are, like your kind of Robert Moses or your Santa Ella, these huge mega structure projects, like, not dissimilar to the stuff that we're seeing at NEOM. So for us, like this is like a space that is really fascinating. Looking at like what is the actual like position of authorship on a kind of master plan like this, which is inherently heterogeneous, right? Like it's a proliferating design ideas across a large scale, disconnected, not relying on kind of a single formal or figural move to tie it together into a kind of a legible design strategy, but more looking at how that design strategy is producing changed behavior in the community. And I don't mean that in like a social engineering way, but just in the way that's like if I want to walk from here to over there, like on that one site down by where we did the housing, like I have to walk literally a mile to cross the street to get to the nearest like grocery store. Like that's that kind of formal proposition is insisting on a way of living that is maybe, punitive to an extent, right? Especially with the kind of income disparity that you see in a city like Los Angeles. So for us, it's starting to put equal significance and energy into reshaping the city as an interface, as well as the design as an interface for improving the way people inhabit space and kind of thinking through that architecture as like this behavioral interface or mediator. And this is, this project was proposed initially and is spearheaded and is being run by Chris Torres from Agency Artifact. And so he already had this kind of concept for the pedestrian streets and its ability to promote changes in urban development at these kind of specific nodes that they're basically what he's doing is really smart. He's tying together pre-existing public transportation sites along this trail so that the amount of actual infrastructural design that would need to happen to make this work is actually really low.
Pre-existing
Yeah.
meaning that currently
Like-
exists, so it used to historically exist, but no more.
Currently exists or will exist in the next couple of years, certainly before the Olympics. So like there's quite a bit of new light rail train development in Los Angeles, different public transportation systems, increased bus routes and things. So what he's doing is looking at like where are these like currently existing and will exist in the next couple of years nodes are, and how can you use those to start to change the neighborhoods in a way that is gives more agency to the occupants and the tenants there, right? Allows them to live lives that are not constrained and punitive to the kind of current development strategies that emerged in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s in Los Angeles, right? Which Mike Davis kind of summarizes in City of Ports. Yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of like reimagining zoning that was said. I mean, I had recently had this conversation about Oahu and Maui. So where I'm located. So Honolulu, when Honolulu went through rapid development, it was right at the moment when of the auto boom, right? So it would be around 1950s, 1940s. That's when Honolulu grew significantly. So it just caught the wind of this automobilization that was happening in the continental US as well. So it's just kind of how Oahu evolved, but other islands maybe not so much compared to Honolulu. So in a way, other islands, if the population there were to increase, then it might have this opportunity to reimagine how cities might evolve as opposed to this sort of like early mid 20th century model.
Yeah, I mean it's certainly not. There's obviously a lot of projects that are in this space. being proposed. The kind of term Amsterdamming gets thrown around a lot, just because using the kind of bicycle and pedestrian friendly city design, more mixed use construction, whether you're in close proximity to your amenities. I think this proposal that Chris is putting forward is just kind of radical in its scale. Like I can't think of others that are operating quite at this extent. And so it's also been interesting to see like how he's thinking about strategizing each of these locations, right? Like it's not like a blanket strategy. Like some places it's like, okay, we don't want to remove every car, but we're gonna have bus lanes or some like, automated vehicle taxis. Like we got the Waymos now in Los Angeles. So it's much more nuanced, right? And I think that is one of the things that these types of models and platforms allow us to do. I think it's very difficult to engage something complex like an urban system at the level of nuance that we're able to now, previously. And, I think again that was something that certainly Leo from our panel, Stuckart at NVRDB, most of the say AI or simulation based work that they do is also around this, is like this fact that our way of engaging something so complex is now is going through a sea change.
So yeah, I think a little bit more on that project. I think you mentioned, I forgot the exact word description that you used, but when you were showing different versions of the Inglewood project, different kinds of aesthetic, and then how you arrived at the current one being that's the most probably like accessible aesthetic that's not too eccentric, right?
Yeah, also, we need to find a model that is constrained enough that we can do this 100 times and it'll always give us like, a solid result, not some kind of weird fractured thing that, some of those images that are in that Flickr reel are I like them, but they're weird. Like they're kind of, they almost look like some of the Gaussian splats. So, like you can't set up an interactive thing with the community if they type something in and it feels like it's just making random noise at them, right?
Right. So this one that you guys are aiming for, this particular project seems like it has to be something that's predictable enough, but also just slightly interesting than completely banal, right? That's sort of the balance that you're striking. And then I think your personal fascination is in the ones that are very much weird and and not accessible. And so that was kind of interesting. And like not knowing almost anything about technically how AI works, I was kind of curious, like how are you like tuning that balance? Is it through a verbal description or something else?
I mean, a lot of different things, like kind of going back to that first diagram I showed, like we have our fingers in every step. So there's like how we are structuring the way the tech, like, so when you type something in there, or if we're using like something that's like voice to text, it's not just like going straight into the model. Like we're passing it through several kind of layers of filtration, reformatting, restructuring, and what's called pre-prompting, where we are embedding some kind of guiding text as well. We are also conditioning the model in a few different ways. One is through kind of retraining it, so on example images. One is using, there's a lot of different ways of manipulating models and conditioning them and constraining their outputs. So, there's things, just like to talk about some open source ones like IP adapter, which it's a way of using like a single or maybe a couple images, where this model extracts essentially like the vectorized version of those images that will then modify the AI model to make stuff more like them. So that, there's this like that's like a kind of one version of the way to do it. I think the version that we ended up using is using the LoRa training to constrain a model on top of a few different models that we larger checkpoints that we had trained up. So it's both just in terms of the engineering, how the prompts come in, what you're doing with those prompts, and then conditioning the model itself, both through training and through these kind of conditional layers. I don't think the version I'll have to double check because I went like as you saw from that video, I went through a bunch. I don't think the version that we're using in the stack is using IP adapters specifically, but we're using a few different things like that. Unclip conditioning, like these are all kind of different variations on
Mm-hmm.
using source material to kind of guide the image production. And then
Mm-hmm.
obviously we're using because it's making videos, we're using things which have like temporal conditioning as well. So like
Mm-hmm.
cog video is what we're using for that, which is a kind of open source model or a model that was just kind of released for doing
Mm-hmm.
video to video. So I mean, even in terms of like, there's an input image that goes into it, which is so I'm using cesium, which is
Mm-hmm.
a 3D map of the world,
Mm-hmm.
but the quality is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
But I can set up a camera in there and do like I can do things like automate an FIR based simple massing, and right, and then turn it into an AI model.
Mm-hmm.
Um, here we go. So I'll just show you the input for the Grand Street. So those images I showed of the like the market and stuff in Grand Street
Mm-hmm.
looks like this.
I don't think it's okay, cool.
So that's the input. I mean,
Okay.
this is just one frame. There's like, 49 frames, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's pretty terrible,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it's like enough information
Mm-hmm.
that I can then feed it through different machine vision stacks to extract things like edges, depth,
Mm-hmm.
as like further ways of conditioning that AI model to get results that are specific and proportioned to that actual real world context, right? Because that's
Mm-hmm.
also important. Like I could make a better apartment building image on Midjourney, but it wouldn't have that actual coherence to the site constraints, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which
That's
is critical in this state, in this condition here, or this specific case, right?
yeah,
Mhm.
it's super fascinating. And then again, like with limited understanding, I kind of get the idea. There are multiple steps, and then also like what it gets trained on has a very sort of large impact on what it produces. So
Mhm.
I'm kind of going back to the idea of bias that you mentioned several times. I mean, like not in this talk, but like I heard you discuss that with the facial recognition of the architects and maybe the work from SciArc.
Mhm.
It I don't know if I can verbalize this question very well, but like it gets me thinking about like um how the imbalance between what gets distributed as an image as a published thing around the world
Mhm.
versus what exists in the real world. So in the case of
Mm.
architecture, it's very easy to discuss, right? Like probably, the works, built projects by very famous architect who would be on the El Croquis or A plus U cover would be heavily distributed as opposed,
Mhm.
compared to any architecture firm's regular building that's in terms of the volume and quantity that's much more. So if you compare the quantity of distributed image of the projects and the actual built building stock, right, there's a huge imbalance, right? So I guess it's understandable that how it heavily influences what something like Midjourney produces as an architectural images. And maybe also how the recently I've seen like these emerging like video producing AI and like people messing around with it and like often ends up with like people always like people eating or fighting each other or
Yeah.
flying away into the space and that's also completely understandable, right? Because that's what like you want to
Yeah.
watch in on TV or Hollywood
Yeah.
movies or something. But like
But
if
it's also these data sets are like, especially for the really large models, like
mhm,
they're basically scraped from the internet,
mhm, mhm.
So like, what is there a lot of on the internet? It's
Right,
yeah, people mukbang and people dancing and
right,
TikTok, Instagram videos,
right. And
Yeah.
maybe this doesn't. really have to do with AI, but like it's kind of goes back to sort of like more primitive question of like what exists in the real world, ratio of what exists in real world and what people would like to distribute and consume. I mean, I think it gets distributed as images because there's the need to consume, right? So people want to watch this stuff. So yeah, it kind of gets me thinking about like this sort of gap between the reality and people's desire or fantasy, or I don't know what they are. I don't know where I'm going with it, but yeah.
Well, I think it's a central problem that is like one of the kind of, let's say, like longest running topics that we've been discussing both in our office and then certainly in academics. Patricia Reed, who's like an artist and philosopher, has this like great term, inductive stagnation, and it's just this thing where if you're working with a system that is trained on a priori data, like is it actually possible for it to make things which exist outside of that data, right? Or it's this idea that um, what we already know is reality. So that's one component of it, right? Like I mean the outside of that project I was showing the interior of with all the kind of big wood stuff. I tried to use some AI rendering techniques, and it was just so idiosyncratic aesthetically, or there just wasn't enough stuff on the internet that I was never able to get a kind of satisfying result of it. Which actually is for us is fascinating. Like we're always looking for those moments where the way that we are setting up these pipelines still maybe it's they're almost like analogs to the way in which like a designer has always historically used these kind of arbitrary abstract machines, whether it's like the kind of Eisenman-esque autonomous or what's the autonomy of formal systems, those kind of genetic algorithms of logic or the formal diagram, these kind of like let's say like arbitrary intercessions into our design thinking, right? That I think produces innovation. I think like when you take kind of expertise and then push it against something which forces it to evolve or adapt, which can be external, can be the constraints of a project you're working on, or it could be like internal, these kind of academic or theoretical mechanism or discursive devices we use to change the way that we think about something. That has value. And so for us, like as we're setting up these models, that's like a big part of it. As we're setting up a pipeline, is thinking about purposely misplacing a model so that it will produce like that is as a strategy for trying to escape inductive stagnation. That's one side of it. And then the other side of it is obviously like, who is making these different platforms and what is their motivation for doing so, right? That also kind of constrains and drives its production. So, Midjourney, they have some new projects that are going to be coming out soon, I think, but their kind of ambition initially was to there's a term they used
Therapy?
Yeah, it's something like image therapy or something. Is this idea that like they wanted to make it as short as time as possible for you to type something in and be happy, right? So they're massively constraining what you do, the type of images that Midjourney puts out, very high quality on one, they mix good images, right? Very fast, right? Because they want as many people to use it as quickly as possible and like using it, right? And use it often. As a way of trying to start to build up an understanding of how people use it too. But that means that like if you're interested in the kind of grotesque and the actual term or what definition of it is something that like sits outside those accepted standards of beauty, then it's hard to produce that kind of stuff with a platform that's designed to make you happy, right? So yeah, there's like two sides to this. One is the inductive stagnation problem, and then one are like what are the kind of agendas of the people that are developing the pipelines.
That's interesting. So the reason for you to, the desire to sort of go outside of the predictable aesthetics? Is that purely sort of like creative artistic desire or intellectual desire, or is there any other motivation?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the motivations between starting this partnership with Laura and Galileo is like to kind of take more seriously how to move more of our projects outside of the kind of theoretical and academic realm and into the practical. And I think when you look at the way technology, humanity has always co-evolved with its technology. Like that's not a new thing since humans were humans. And this kind of continued evolution, the way we live, the way even in the last 200 years, like it's significant difference in terms of the way we think about personal space, or like as you were talking about in relationship to the way urban design happened relative to the automobile. I think that we're in a moment right now where there's like a significant space that architects or other designers that are engaged with the built environment could start to take on at looking at the way all these interfaces that we're dealing with, even the way that we consume media now is changing the way people want to occupy space, right? Even just the kind of proliferation of work from home, right? There's a space here in the same way that kind of early modernism was looking at designing an architecture that was appropriate for this new professional class, right? Like this kind of new non-aristocracy, still fairly well off by today's standards, but their idea of like kind of looking at what would designing for this kind of new democratic style of living would be, right? I think that we're in a moment right now where that same kind of interrogation needs to happen, and there's an opportunity for thinking some aspects of housing. And so if we're in that inductive stagnation problem, or we're using pipelines which are driven by maybe larger corporations that have economic incentive to maintain a status quo, which might happen if they've invested significantly in large software stacks and they don't want to rewrite everything, right? That would necessarily produce a kind of stagnation to the innovation of design, keeping up with the way that we are changing. And I think as a discipline, that's really dangerous. That kind of, especially as people often lament the lack of relevance of architecture as a cultural agent in contemporary society. Like it'll get worse if we're not producing spatial design that is engaging with all of these new layers about how we live.
But I mean, that's one side of, I mean, architects producing, visuals or drawings that would be turned into physical spaces. That's one role. But then I guess there's kind of an advocacy role of, trying to impact policy or zoning or whatever the local government's doing. There's that component too, right? And I think a lot of what you're talking about, like especially to do with housing, it's less and less about the design itself, but it's more about the design of either the economical system or the permitting, or all these like legal system that's surrounding the housing. I think I went to I think I was at this lecture by some kind of neighborhood development agency that's part of the city of Honolulu, that's talking about housing and incentive to they were talking about like allowing more FAR for those projects that contain more affordable units. Like significant increase of FAR if you have more percentage of affordable housing. And I think how the person was saying that so housing no longer works if you see it as investment, or like if it's something that developer needs to make profit out of, then like affordable housing would no longer work. So it has to be the financial source has to come from elsewhere. It's probably maybe it becomes more like a source, social political agenda, and like probably I don't know if I should be taking a position but anyway, like that's what it sounds like. And in a way, it's a design. It's not visual design, but it's like a social system. And I don't know where I'm going with it, but you were
I mean,
touching
I
on
don't
it.
think you can extract the two from each other. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that if you are making design for a housing project,
Hmm.
you are making a statement about how people live and a
Hmm.
social economic statement, and you're
Hmm.
either being naive about that or you're trying to take it on seriously.
Hmm.
So again, it's kind of where like maybe image is not the kind of space for radicality
Hmm.
now that it's ubiquitous. Although I'm not, I don't really want to like tie myself onto that train too
Hmm.
aggressively because I think there's still space for aesthetic innovation. But
Hmm.
a project like R50, I'm going to butcher the architect's names. Is Heidi and von Beckerath and Eva and Jesko Frisser. I feel really bad about this. Like that's to me is like a really fascinating project, right? And it specifically is a type of housing plan and spatial design that emerges through cooperative
Oh, you mean
housing development, right?
the French architects that got Pritzker Prize recently, or different ones?
Yeah.
Okay, okay, okay.
Hmm. Yeah,
I
so
mean,
like it's a new plan. It's like yeah, as like a if you're just taking a photograph of the exterior,
mhm,
it's not going to appear radical in the way that we tend to think of from
mhm,
something like like a Zaha project or
mhm, mhm,
uh, any of the great LA architects. But as a kind of proposal for the way humans live and as a floor plan, it's really strange,
mhm, mhm.
by traditional standards. And there's a so for me, like it's like we can't be talking about these kind of economic social side of things without and like innovating in that space
Mhm,
without also
mhm.
innovating on the building design itself because I
Right.
think that they're actually hand in hand.
Mhm, mhm. That's interesting because I think I mean, maybe loosely coming back to the idea of bias, I think there's probably inherent bias of if you're going to talk about these sort of social justice, housing equality type of projects, your aesthetics would probably look like this. There's probably a preconception of that, right?
Yeah, but why? I mean, this again is an inductive stagnation problem, right?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
I kind of I mean so I don't know if I want to include this or not, but like when I see students projects, right? So depending on the schools, there will be kind of I think students going to maybe like a couple of different directions. One is, I think the students here are very concerned about these very sort of like local social these type of issues. And there's almost like if you're gonna do these affordable housing things, it almost seems like there's a bias, like it has to be this. And
Hmm.
I kind of heard that elsewhere too, like in LA, my fellow faculty from the school I used to teach previously was working on assisted living or those
Hmm.
kind of low income housing, and it's almost like if you're doing low income housing, it can't have nice design or something like that. Like you try to make um and my language becomes poor, but like as he was describing, he was trying to work within the budget and still create this great design. But then
Hmm.
like anything that looks sort of not luxury, but more than perceived bare minimum, it becomes the object of criticism because you're
Hmm.
adding these extravagant things for an low income housing. So it just kind of like through criticism, it gets sort of stripped down to this bare minimum, almost non-design thing. So I guess that's the sort of the stereotype slash bias that I'm talking about. Um,
Yeah, I mean, those are extremely constrained projects, and there's a
yeah.
lot to deal with in them. And so I'm not in any way being critical of the designers that are actually like doing that work. I haven't
Mhm.
worked on that type of project in
Mhm.
20 years. So it's been a while, right? But it is a bit context dependent too. Like I think there are countries or contexts that have different views about kind of socialized housing, public housing, or low income housing. Yeah, I think the kind of ambition, and I think everyone who's working on, maybe not everyone, but I think it sounds like your colleague that are working on those, like their ambition is to make the best possible housing for the tenants there. Like this idea that low income shouldn't be some kind of punitive housing condition. But yeah, then they're running into the filters of perception, like of like you're dealing with the state at that point, right? And their influence on the project to secure funding. So if it looks like you're being frivolous, then yeah, you come under fire. But so I think there's that side of it, and the other side of it is like how do we advocate?
Might have been a neighborhood hearing type of thing.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean that's an interesting thing too, right? Like how do you advocate for certain design, or how do you communicate that some aspect of your design that might be innovative or eccentric compared to what people have seen before ultimately results in a higher quality of living for those people. Some contexts are different. Like I remember working in New Orleans in the Lower Ninth Ward project at the community meetings for that. And the bulk of the community actually, and that was a very unique context. It was like 90% tenant owned for the houses that were destroyed in Katrina. And specifically in the Lower Ninth Ward. I think it was something really high like that, which is unusual for lower income neighborhoods in the US. But the community members that were attending the town hall meetings, like I think there was an initial instinct in the project to have more conservative, like let's put vernacular in quotes, designs in the selection process. And through the community meetings, like the community kind of made it clear that they didn't want those houses again, that those weren't like houses they were living in by choice, like they were living in them because that was all that they were allowed to live in, financially, economically. So they actually wanted, the more innovative stuff. But that is like, that's anecdotal, right? So like every context is different. And so I think this goes again to the kind of problem of like, how do you deal with like something complex and nuanced as large scale urban projects? Because they are heterogeneous, they are different. There's different stakes depending on where you're working there. But yeah, like if there's an opportunity, I think the ambition should still be there, right? To try to innovate in a positive way on the living conditions of people through the architecture.
Okay.
But maybe it doesn't make sense to have a 30-foot cantilever on a low-income housing project to spend all your money on the steel, right? But there's other, design innovation that can occur in that space, right?
Maybe the last question. You mentioned the desire to have intelligence other than our own to design something. So I guess my question with that is why that motive? And then I guess how do you feel about your own sort of subjective creativity of wanting to do, for example, move this thing here? So like how do you deal with that when you're like, how do those two work together in your brain?
I mean, there's two sides to it, right? Like the kind of desire for this other intelligence is for that kind of other pattern recognition. So looking at the same problem we've been staring at for the last, in our case, almost 30 years now since we graduated from college. Is it? No, 20 years. We're not that old.
No.
Sorry.
Not yet. Yeah.
Like it is like we kind of a lot of times you're staring at the same problem over and over again. You're like you can't find some innovative solution to it. So just passing it through the filter of a machine which understands the same problem with different kind of biases or pattern recognition ability, or maybe nuance in some cases, will expose an opportunity within that context that you hadn't thought of before. Right? So there's that kind of search again for like innovation, like maybe not in a purely solutionist sense, but an other that opens up like other creative opportunities. So that's why the kind of analysis pattern recognition side of this stuff is still so fascinating to us as a significant part of our project. And And then the other side is, I think it's, again, going back to the idea that we always create these abstract machines or, academic devices or intellectual devices to kind of force us out of our comfort zones, to produce innovation. Like for me, like that was, it allows us to kind of question what's actually valuable in our design education too, right? Like, so the whole exercise with like the Desert House project that I showed a little bit of, or even the Talent Pavilion that you and I worked on together was, saying, all right, like legible partie and diagram and formal diagram and for plan and architecture doesn't actually matter. Like there's these other ways of shaping space that are equally viable and result in a different way of living or inhabiting, a site, right? And then, the last end, we go back and forth on this, I think in the office, especially now that I have partners, I tend to be fairly historically build a lot of black boxes and I like embed all of my intentions and agendas kind of into the design of that black box or that machine. So it's a black box in the sense that I put stuff in and a building comes out or something comes out, right? Not as a black box as like I don't know what's going on in there. Like I think that term gets thrown around a lot in architectural discourse about kind of AI. It's like, oh, it's a black box, it's mysterious. It's like yeah, we don't know what every single weight in those trillions of parameters or whatever are doing, but we know theoretically what's happening in there, right?
It's translucent box, maybe.
Yeah, it's a translucent box. It's like a little opaque, but so I think that kind of way of working where I was, especially as I'm trying to transition from doing like kind of purely academic or theoretical work and speculative work to trying to actually begin to land some of these things in the real world. We are building a lot more kind of let's say like holes into the box for moments of interface or interaction, like in the kind of program diagram thing. I think like 4 years ago, if I'd done the program simulator, in fact, I have, like I would just say like, here's the site, here's the program, go. And I would have been happy with the result, but now we're building these tools where all three of us can like interject with our different agendas or ideas about the design in real time with the engagement of the model, right? I don't do that for everything. I think that there's certain stuff where the benefits to real-time engagement are, kind of diminish in relationship to the sophistication of the model. Like often the more sophisticated a simulation is, the less likely you are able to run it at real time, which means the kind of model for interface as a designer or interjection into the flow of the process is different. But yeah, I think it's there's a kind of pivot to more interactive app development in the office right now.
So I guess I mean one of the things I was gonna ask was like it's been a while since you last done this sort of subjective, right? Like I want to move this here, so I'm gonna move this here. So I was gonna ask like, is there a sort of like desire to go back to that more? But then I guess making a translucent box that allows certain level of interactivity where you can control certain things to a certain extent is probably partially that.
Yeah, like do I miss just modeling crazy geometry in Maya for 20 hours straight or 40 hours straight sometimes? No, I'm good. I grew up drawing watercolor painting. I had to go to art classes as a kid. Like I actually learned how to do like proper washes and stuff and had to my bringing home my art class portfolios was always scarier than my report cards. But last time I drew like a charcoal rendering, I don't know, probably like 20 years. And that's not like for me, like I've always been interested in the design and that kind of speculative entity coming out of it. The mechanisms I used to get there, I tend to be less nostalgic or tied to. Like we kind of continue to evolve rapidly. And for me, it's more about that kind of finding those others, right? Or the other organizational strategies or other aesthetic strategies that keep me interested in design. So yeah, like explicitly modeling stuff. I had to do it a little bit this summer, and I had to dust off my Rhino and Maya skills, and it was a little slow at first, but you pick it back up. But yeah, we hit a problem where my beautiful machines couldn't perfectly nail everything we needed. So I had to intervene as human. We're getting there. Like the joke in the office and in my program at the school is that the movie Wall-E is an aspirational film, and that our agenda is to try to move architecture to a space where we're all just like hanging out in hover chairs, drinking Slurpees while AI does the rest. It's not totally a joke.
Right. Sounds good. So thank you very much, Casey, for speaking to us again. ありがとうございました。
ありがとうございました。Thanks, Sushi.
Thank you.
Bye.